in front of 9 cameras under the marble arches of the Capitol and before 27 lawmakers, Katie Porter chuckled. It wasn't loud, but it was loud enough. J.D. Vance didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't chase applause. What he said next didn't just defend a veteran. It cracked open a silence too many had accepted for far too long. A silence about those who served and were forgotten. A man had lost his leg for this country. Another had laughed. And in that moment, America had to ask itself, are we still the nation they believed in? Because this isn't just a story about politics. It's about memory, about dignity, about what happens when someone finally says what others were too comfortable ignoring. The events you're about to witness are told through dramatization, inspired by public figures and real struggles faced by working Americans, veterans, and families across this country. While the dialogue and moments are fictionalized, the questions they raise, the feelings they stir, are deeply real. Stay with us, because honoring the forgotten starts with hearing their truth. The room was too cold. Always was. They said it was to preserve the equipment, but J.D. Vance had long suspected it was to keep the people inside from ever getting too comfortable. Capitol Hill, room 2141, the Budget Oversight Committee. One of those government chambers where decisions were made in suits, but the consequences played out in steel towns no one in that room could pronounce. The walls were lined with portraits of forgotten chairmen, names etched in brass, their legacies mostly paperwork. The air carried the scent of overbrewed coffee, floor polish, and paper that had been handled too many times by too few people who actually cared. At precisely 9:03 a.m., the hearing began. The gavel struck once. Congresswoman Katie Porter spoke first. Of course, she did. She didn't just walk into the room, she owned it. Her sleeves were rolled up, her charts already mounted, and her tone sharp like a blade honed by years of media soundbites. A poster behind her read, "Cut through the fat." She gestured toward a color-coded pie chart big enough to cover the national debt itself. "Let's talk about where your money actually goes," she said, her voice dripping with that well-practiced mix of sarcasm and civic righteousness. $94 million allocated last year to veteran outreach programming in states that couldn't even define the word outreach. I mean, do we really need to spend taxpayer dollars teaching veterans how to email? A few chuckles floated across the room like unwanted static. Behind the second row of aides and analysts, a door opened quietly. He didn't speak. He didn't wave. He didn't even make eye contact. J.D. Vance stepped into the room with the weight of a man who carried not just a briefcase, but 1,000 unseen things. His navy blue suit was simple, conservative. But there was something about his presence, an energy so still it felt volatile, the kind of stillness found in men who don't interrupt. But don't forget either. He took his seat without a word. No aide whispered in his ear. No staffer handed him notes. He didn't need them. Porter continued, flipping to another chart. Here's another gem. Line item 332B, Veteran Resource Centers in towns with declining populations. If we're being honest, they're pop-up bunkers in places no one visits and no one lives. I mean, do we really need a PTSD counselor in a town with 800 people and 3 stoplights? Another chuckle. This one came from a congressman on the far left. Porter smirked. And that's when the camera cut, just briefly, to JD's face. His eyes narrowed, just enough. A flicker of something ancient passed through his expression. Not rage, not even offense, but memory. The kind that arrives uninvited. The kind that comes with a face and a name you never forgot, even if the country did. He leaned back slightly in his chair, fingers steepled, gaze fixed. He didn't speak, but the silence around him shifted, as if even the microphones knew something had changed. Porter continued unfazed, unaware, or perhaps uninterested, in who had just entered the ring. Outside, the wind pressed against the Capitol dome like it wanted in. Inside, a storm was gathering, but no one saw it yet. No one but J.D., and he was watching, waiting. Because the next sentence out of Katie Porter's mouth wasn't just going to cross a line, it was going to set something in motion. And when it did, America wouldn't be laughing. "And here comes another sob story from Ohio," Katie Porter quipped. flipping a page on her binder without even glancing up. The words hung in the air like the sharp crack of a gavel. Not loud, but loud enough. The room chuckled, quietly, nervously. Some out of agreement, others because it felt easier than pushing back. Easier to laugh than to ask what she really meant. JD didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't show his teeth or tap a pen. He simply looked up, slowly. His eyes met hers for less than a second, but it was long enough to see it. The smile, small, crooked, confident, dismissive. It wasn't the smile of someone who hated veterans. It was the smile of someone who didn't think they mattered enough to be taken seriously. And that to JD was worse. Katie kept talking, sliding effortlessly into a paragraph about trimming symbolic budget lines. Something about public sentiment not being a budgeting strategy. The words were perfectly rehearsed, delivered with polish, pace, and poise. She'd used this line before, probably tested it in multiple districts, but JD wasn't listening anymore. Instead, he reached down and pulled a yellow legal pad from his bag, one corner bent, a faint coffee stain in the top right. He uncapped a pen, slow and deliberate, not for show, not for anyone else in the room. He began to write, not bullet points, not rebuttals, but names. A corporal from Marietta, a steelworker turned sergeant from Chillicothe, a single mother who served 2 tours in Iraq and now sold secondhand clothes at a flea market in Mansfield. Not statistics, not quotes. People. JD wrote as if he were carving something into the page, as if ink could cut through marble. The room moved around him. Slides were projected, words were exchanged. Laughter floated above policy graphs. But JD wasn't inside it anymore. He was back in the shelter in Cincinnati, back on a bench beside a man named Louis, who hadn't smiled in 2 years, but still stood for the national anthem every time it played over the shelter's old TV. "They always say we're brave," Louis had muttered, staring at the floor. "But when the war ends and the room clears out, guess who's left holding the silence?" Katie Porter's voice cut back in, pulling JD to the surface. "And if we continue coddling nostalgia instead of reforming these bloated legacy programs, we'll bankrupt the future for a generation that never wore a uniform and never asked to." Another low laugh from someone on the far end of the room. JD didn't look. He just wrote one more name. Then he stopped. The pen rested between his fingers. He sat back, shoulders square, posture still, eyes fixed forward, not at Katie but through her, not angry, resolved. Across the room, a junior staffer for a senator glanced nervously at JD, sensing something subtle had shifted, but no one else noticed. Not yet. The hearing moved on, like a train ignoring the tremor on the tracks. But JD knew what was coming, knew what he would say. He closed the pad softly, as if sealing something sacred, and in the silence between her next sentence and his breath, something unspoken took root. It wasn't loud, but it was loud enough. He remembered the chair. It wasn't much. Just a folding metal frame with a tear in the vinyl seat and a squeak that groaned whenever someone shifted their weight. But in that shelter in Cincinnati, it was Louis's chair. And when JD Vance walked in that afternoon, Louis hadn't moved from it in 3 hours. No one had spoken yet. JD stood near the entrance with his coat still buttoned, scanning the room. The walls were painted a color that might have once been cream, now faded into the yellow of old sorrow. Coffee brewed somewhere in the back, sharp and burnt. Fluorescent lights buzzed above like a swarm that never rested. "Senator, right?" Louis finally muttered without turning. JD nodded, even though Louis wasn't looking. "Not here to campaign." Louis gave a dry laugh, the kind that carried no humor. "Good. We don't vote anymore." JD walked over slowly, pulled up a chair across from him. "Saturday. You live here?" JD asked. Louis shrugged. "I stay here." There was a difference, JD realized. He glanced around. Bunk beds lined the back wall. A small table near the window held a chessboard with missing pieces. A Bible sat open on a cracked windowsill, pages ruffled from weather, not reading. Louis finally looked at him, sharp blue eyes sunken but steady. His coat was 2 sizes too large. On his wrist, a faded Semper Fi tattoo barely visible beneath layers of worn flannel. "I used to walk straighter," he said, tapping his cane, "but the leg didn't come back from Fallujah." JD didn't answer, didn't flinch, just listened. "You're here for the photo op?" Louis asked, tone flat. "No cameras," JD replied. Louis tilted his head, curious. "I'm not here to fix it," JD added. "I'm just trying to understand why we still let it happen." Silence again. Then Louis leaned forward, pulled a blanket back from the edge of his bunk. JD followed his hand and froze. There, half tucked under a thin mattress, lay a bronze star. No display case, no frame, no shelf, just metal and ribbon, dulled by dust and disregard. JD reached toward it instinctively. Louis stopped him with a glance. "Don't touch it," he said. "They already did." His voice was calm, but inside it, a fracture. Not bitterness, something deeper. Abandonment. "I'm not broken," Louis said quietly. "I was discarded." Those 4 words struck JD harder than any policy memo ever had. Discarded, not failed, not injured, thrown away. And in that moment, JD saw it, the real division, the one no chart could capture. It wasn't just blue states and red states, rich counties and poor. It was America with a microphone, and America in a folding chair no one noticed. He stayed another hour just listening. No promises made, no slogans, just presence. Louis eventually stood and offered his hand. "I don't need you to fix me," he said. "Just don't forget you sat here." Now in the fluorescent-lit committee room in D.C., JD sat in another chair. Cushioned, polished, monogrammed. But he remembered the one that squeaked, and while the others talked in percentages and projections, he stared at his yellow legal pad and ran his thumb across the edge. One name, then another, and one more. Louis's name was already there. Because some people bring statistics to a hearing, JD had brought a war. The highway into Middletown, Ohio, used to shine in the summer. Now it coughed up gravel as JD's car eased off the ramp, the radio off, the windows shut against the late autumn chill. On either side, old billboards peeled like sunburnt skin, ads for steel, paint, and promises that had long since expired. He hadn't taken this road in months, but the town didn't change. Not really. He passed the old auto parts factory first, Crawford Metals, now just an echo in corrugated tin. The fence was rusted through in 3 places. Someone had spray-painted "still standing" across the loading dock doors. But even the paint looked tired. 2 blocks later, he slowed as he reached the broken sidewalk where he and Eli Graham used to race bikes after school. Eli had joined the Marines straight out of high school, killed in Helmand Province. JD remembered carrying the folded flag to his mother. Remembered the way she touched it like it was her son's cheek. Remembered how no one from Washington had come. Just 2 streets over, there was the lot where the old VFW hall used to be, torn down, replaced by a vape shop and a payday loan store with neon signs that buzzed during the day. The irony, the signs still read, "Support our troops." He turned down Auburn Avenue and parked in front of the house where he'd grown up. The yard was overgrown, a "for sale" sign tilted sideways. He didn't get out, didn't need to. Instead, he sat behind the wheel, watching the wind play with the remnants of a Walmart bag caught in the fence. This town used to mean something. Not to the country, not to the headlines, but to the people who lived here. They believed in things, not just God and country, but work. Pride in showing up. Pride in welding the steel that held up bridges across the country they'd never afford to visit. And when the factories started closing, when the pensions evaporated, when the storefronts filled with "for lease" signs instead of gifts at Christmas, they didn't riot. They enlisted. They put on uniforms. Because they thought that maybe if they couldn't serve their town, they could still serve their country. JD knew their names. Some came back to divorces. Some came back to opioids. Some didn't come back at all. "We came home with medals," one of them told him once, "and ended up standing in line for cold ravioli from a church pantry." He saw it all now like a documentary running in his mind. Bobby with the missing leg, Angie who left 2 kids behind in Syria, And Chris, who used to be the best mechanic in 3 counties, now begging the VA for enough pills to get through a week. This was the America that sat invisible in the back of every committee room in D.C., the America that didn't trend, the America that Katie Porter had laughed about without knowing its name. He looked out the window again. A man walked past with a cane made from what looked like a broomstick handle wrapped in duct tape. Behind him, a child in a jacket 2 sizes too small kicked gravel into a gutter. That was the thing about Middletown. It didn't break all at once. It cracked slowly, like a windshield spidering from the corner, while people pretended it was still safe to drive. JD finally turned the key in the ignition, the engine humming like it had something left to prove. He didn't come here for nostalgia. He came to remember what was real. Because when he sat back down in that chair in D.C., he wouldn't be alone. He'd be carrying every cracked sidewalk, every empty factory, every folded flag in this town like it was part of his spine. And maybe this time, someone would finally hear them. Louis was waiting when JD walked back into the shelter 2 days later. Same chair, same sag in the cushion. Only this time, he wasn't staring off into the distance. He was holding something in his hand, creased, stained, the edges curled from being folded and unfolded more times than made sense. "A letter?" JD asked, sliding into the seat across from him. Louis didn't answer right away, just looked at the paper like it was a live wire. "I wrote it 6 years ago," he said finally. "Didn't send it. Figured it'd get shredded before anyone read past the first line." JD nodded slowly. "May I?" Louis hesitated, then handed it over like it cost him something. JD unfolded it with care. The handwriting was jagged but firm, as if each letter had been carved instead of written. He read it silently, but the words roared. "To whoever still pretends to read this, I didn't lose my leg for silence, or for pity. I lost it hoping someone would still see me. But you don't. You see numbers. You see line items. You see veteran programs in towns that no longer have banks, hospitals, or reasons to stay. You write checks to ghosts and call it gratitude. You wave flags while forgetting the names they draped over. You build memorials for the dead and cut funding for the living. And then, when we get angry, when we ask why the country we bled for is letting us rot on the side of the road, you say we're unstable. Or worse, you ignore us altogether. I'm not asking for thanks. I'm asking to matter. Because if you can't see me now, then what was the point of serving a country that only honors you after you're gone?" JD read it again, slower this time, the weight of each sentence settling in. He folded it back along the same tired creases and looked at Louis. The old Marine stared straight ahead, eyes glassy but jaw firm, like someone trying not to care about whether or not he was heard. JD slipped the letter into the inside pocket of his jacket. "If you can't send it," he said quietly, "maybe I will." Louis said nothing, but his hand flexed once, as if holding back more than words. Across the shelter, someone changed the channel on the TV. A talking head ranted about budgets and defense waste. JD didn't look. He already knew the tone, the rhythm, the script. He stood. "You know," Louis said as JD turned to leave, "some folks think we're bitter." JD paused. "I'm not bitter," Louis continued. "I'm just done being quiet." JD gave him a slow nod. "Then maybe it's time someone else got loud." Outside, the air bit harder than before, but JD barely noticed. His hand pressed over the letter in his coat like it was a compass. Not a speech, not a soundbite, a signal. He didn't know what committee he'd read it in, or who would try to talk over him when he did. But he knew one thing. Once Louis's words were spoken into the record, they'd be harder to erase. And maybe, just maybe, someone in that chamber would remember that a war doesn't end when the boots come home. It ends when the country finally listens. The room hadn't changed, but JD had. Same fluorescent lights, same stale air, same murmuring pages turning, and nameplates gleaming under artificial brightness. But this time, JD wasn't just carrying a binder of notes. He was carrying Louis's voice. He sat quietly as another congressman walked through slides about defense redundancies. JD's name was next on the schedule. He didn't glance at his team. He didn't need a countdown. When the chair finally nodded toward him, JD adjusted his mic, cleared his throat once, and began. Last week I visited a shelter in Cincinnati. Nothing fancy. Peeling paint, one working heater. Inside was a man named Louis. Served 2 tours, lost his leg in Fallujah. He paused. No drama, just gravity. His Bronze Star was stuffed under a mattress, not displayed, hidden. When I asked him why, he said, "I'm not broken. I was discarded." A few heads turned. Some looked down. Louis wrote a letter to this Congress 6 years ago. He never mailed it. I have it here today. "Oh, come on," Katie Porter interrupted, voice cutting through the air like a butter knife with just enough rust. "Are we really doing another sob story from Ohio?" She didn't even look up. Just a quick roll of her eyes, a flip of her pen. And then came the chuckle. Small, dismissive. The kind you give when something's beneath you, not worth your attention, let alone your respect. But it echoed. God, it echoed. The room froze. Not by command, but by instinct. JD stopped mid-sentence. His hand still rested on the yellow legal pad, where Louis's name was written at the top in sharp, steady ink. For a beat, the entire committee chamber hung in silence. Even the air seemed to still, waiting. He looked at her, not with rage, not with theatrics, but with something colder. Stillness. The kind of stillness that carries weight. She looked up briefly, as if surprised he'd stopped. "Excuse me?" JD asked. Calm, clipped. Katie blinked. "I said, no, I heard you," he replied. "I just wanted to be sure you were laughing at a man who bled for your right to do so." A ripple went through the room. Not gasps, not chatter, just a shift. The kind that comes when the temperature changes and no one knows what to do with their hands. JD didn't blink. He leaned forward. "You don't have to agree with me. You can challenge my facts, my math, even my motives. But if you're going to sit in that chair and laugh when I speak the name of a veteran who sleeps in a shelter tonight, then maybe you're not here to serve the people who put you there." Someone on the Democratic side lowered their eyes. A Republican aide's hand hovered over a phone, unsure whether to tweet or freeze. Katie Porter said nothing. The smirk was gone. Whatever point she had loaded up next, gone too. JD looked around the room slowly. "This isn't a performance. This is the only microphone Louis will ever have, and you just tried to laugh him off the record." He folded the letter back into his pocket, not as a prop, as a promise. "I'll yield my time, but I won't yield his." The chair tried to speak, stumbled, cleared his throat. The hearing would continue, technically. But nothing after that moment would land the same way, because JD hadn't just spoken. He'd stopped the room, and somewhere in Ohio, a man named Louis would watch the clip and finally hear someone say out loud what he had written in silence. For a moment, it looked like JD was going to let it slide. He set the paper down slowly, folding it once, then again, until the letter disappeared beneath his hand. The room exhaled. Pens resumed their quiet tapping. Katie Porter turned a page in her binder, as if the interruption had already passed. The tension began to uncoil until JD adjusted his mic. A small motion, intentional, not rushed, not angry, but unmistakably deliberate. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes locked on Porter. Not with fury, but with a precision that made people start listening again before he even spoke. "Congresswoman Porter," he said evenly, "did you just laugh when I mentioned a man who bled for this country?" No one breathed. Katie froze, mid-note. A few chairs creaked as staffers subtly shifted to look at one another. One aide stopped typing. Another slowly lifted their phone. Porter blinked, then forced a shrug. "Senator, we're discussing national appropriations. If we let every anecdote dictate policy—" "It wasn't an anecdote," JD cut in, voice still steady. "It was a name, a man, a Marine, and you laughed." Her smile faltered. He didn't give her time to gather the next defense. "This isn't theater for me. It's not optics. I sat across from that man last week. He handed me a letter he wrote to people like you, and I promised I'd bring it here." His voice didn't rise, but the temperature in the room dropped a degree. "Do you know what that letter said?" Porter didn't answer. JD didn't wait. He wrote, "I didn't lose my leg for silence, or for pity. I lost it hoping someone would still see me." And you chuckled. Her pen lowered. JD turned, scanning the room now. I've sat in this chamber while we've debated tax brackets, social programs, line items, and loopholes. I've watched charts fly across that screen like we were running a PowerPoint competition. But this moment, is not about budget lines. His tone softened, but the steel beneath it sharpened. This is about whether the people who serve us still matter once we no longer need them to serve. A pause, a silence with shape. You don't have to like me, Congresswoman. I don't need that. But what I won't accept, what I can't accept, is a room that treats a veteran's sacrifice like background noise. Somewhere behind him, a chair creaked as someone leaned forward. JD looked at her again, this time with a calmness that landed harder than any raised voice. You smirked, you scoffed, and in doing so, you told Louis, and every man and woman like him, that their story doesn't belong in this room. Katie opened her mouth, closed it, then folded her hands. JD leaned back slightly, exhaling through his nose. I want the record to reflect, he said to the chair, that this wasn't just a policy disagreement. This was a moment when a public servant laughed at the pain of a soldier. And I want every American watching this to decide what that says about who we become. The chair cleared his throat, lips parted to speak, but words didn't come right away. The room wasn't just quiet now. It was witnessing, not a debate, not a rivalry, a reckoning, and JD had delivered it without raising his voice once. JD didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. It was the quiet in his words, the sharp, deliberate calm that pulled the oxygen out of the room. Each syllable landed like it had been weighed in iron before being spoken. He looked straight at Katie Porter, but he wasn't attacking her. Not directly, not personally. He was inviting her to look in the mirror. I know we come from different worlds, he began, eyes steady. You've made a career out of numbers. I respect that. There's value in data, but not all truth is found in spreadsheets. He turned slightly toward the committee chair, but his voice was for the whole room. Last week, I walked into a shelter in Cincinnati. It was snowing. Half the radiators were cold, but a man named Louis was sitting by the window like he was still standing watch. Marine Corps, 2 tours, Bronze Star, lost his leg overseas. He showed me the medal. It was shoved under a mattress. He let the image linger. When I asked him why it wasn't on the wall, he said, I'm not broken, I was discarded. No one moved. He wrote a letter to this body 6 years ago, never mailed it. He figured it wouldn't matter. JD slowly reached into his inside pocket, pulled the folded paper free, not for show, but like holding a relic. I told him if he couldn't send it, maybe I would. His fingers tightened slightly on the edges. He wrote, I didn't lose my leg for silence or for pity. I lost it hoping someone would still see me. JD let the words land. That man was real. That letter is real. And when I read it here today, you laughed. A soft inhale echoed from the back of the room. Someone cleared their throat, like the weight of the moment had become too physical to ignore. You can challenge my policies. You can call me out on my proposals, my votes, even my motives. That's fair. That's politics. But don't laugh at him. Now he turned back to Katie, not cruelly, but with clarity. You don't have to like me, but you will not laugh at the man who gave you that seat. The line didn't shout. It didn't tremble, but it cut through the silence like a bell tolling over stone. Katie Porter stared ahead, her face unreadable. Behind her, an aide scribbled something frantically on a notepad, as if trying to outrun the moment already slipping into history. JD looked back to the chair. There's a story we tell ourselves in this building, that we're here to make hard choices, to represent people who don't always get heard. He scanned the rows, the staffers, the nameplates, the flags. Well, Louis didn't get heard, not until now. And if what I've said here today makes some of you uncomfortable, good. Because this chamber was never built for comfort. It was built for accountability. He placed the letter carefully on the table in front of him, his fingers resting on it one last time. I yield the remainder of my time, Mr. Chairman, but let the record show I did not yield his. There was no applause. This wasn't that kind of room, but something had shifted. You could feel it in the shoulders of those watching, in the slow stillness of people unsure whether to look up or look away. The hearing continued, technically, but the conversation had changed, and in homes across America, veterans, widows, parents, sons, someone would hear that line and know it was finally meant for them. The clip hit the internet less than 2 hours after the hearing ended. At first, it was just a CSPAN upload, raw footage, no graphics, no music, just a grainy angle of J.D. Vance calmly speaking into his mic while the camera slowly zoomed in. "You don't have to like me, but you will not laugh at the man who gave you that seat." No one thought it would go viral, until someone cut it down to 49 seconds, added the subtitle, "Watch This," and posted it with the caption, "J.D. Vance just stopped Congress cold." By nightfall, the views crossed 1.2 million. By morning, 9th April, veterans began reposting the clip with their own commentary. Some filmed themselves watching it, silent, hats on, hand over mouth. Others stitched the video with their own service photos, medals, or folded flags. One man in Kansas simply stared into the camera and said, "He finally said it." A woman in Pennsylvania added, "I don't even agree with him politically, but today, he spoke for my husband and for me." News anchors scrambled to reframe it. On MSNBC, a roundtable debated whether the moment was authentic outrage or political theater done masterfully. Fox News called it a masterclass in how to bring the heartland into the halls of power. CNN split the screen. JD's clip on the left, Katie Porter's reaction on the right, playing over and over. Porter hadn't spoken publicly, not yet, but the camera had caught her face at the end of the exchange. Eyes frozen, lips drawn tight, one hand clutching her pen as if to anchor herself to anything other than the weight of the moment. In the hours after the hearing, she slipped out a side door with no press following. Not because no one cared, but because everyone was still watching him. JD didn't give interviews that night. He didn't post a thread. He didn't celebrate. Instead, he went back to his office, closed the door, and sat with the letter open in front of him one more time. "I didn't lose my leg for silence." It wasn't a slogan. It was a sentence carved from bone. And now it wasn't just in his pocket. It was in the bloodstream of a country that had spent too long forgetting its promise to those who kept it alive. In small towns across America, barber shops and breakfast diners muted their sports TVs and turned up the sound. A substitute teacher in Alabama printed out JD's quote and taped it to the chalkboard. A pastor in Montana read the line aloud during Sunday service. "No politics, just pause and prayer." The clip was shared in Facebook groups titled "Veterans Without Homes" and "Daughters of the Forgotten." By Monday, a nonprofit had launched a campaign to frame Louis' quote on plaques and send them to shelters across all 50 states. And Louis? He watched the video from a cracked phone screen in a Cincinnati shelter, earbuds plugged in like it was sacred audio. He didn't smile. Not exactly, but his eyes didn't look down when it ended. He whispered, mostly to himself, "He didn't change it. He read it the way I wrote it." In Washington, the committee reconvened the next morning. Porter was present, her hair neat, her notes in order, but this time she didn't interrupt anyone. And when JD spoke again, just a procedural update, nothing dramatic, she didn't look at her binder. She looked at him. Because some rooms echo long after the words are spoken, and this one wasn't done echoing yet. By midweek, JD Vance's name wasn't just trending. It had fractured into headlines, hashtags, and opinion pieces that fought to define him faster than he could finish a sentence. Hashtag stand with Vance. Hashtag silence is respect. Hashtag Congress laughs at veterans. Cable news ran endless split screens. On one side, JD's face, frozen mid-sentence, calm but cutting. On the other, Katie Porter's expression as the laugh faded and the weight of it landed. Pundits took sides within hours. Fox News praised his measured moral clarity. MSNBC called it a calculated moment of political performance. One anchor said he'd weaponized dignity. Another said he'd defended the invisible. Some compared him to McCain. Others called him dangerous, authentic, opportunistic, a throwback, a threat. Everyone had a label. Few had listened to the whole hearing. Inside JD's D.C. office, his staff worked overtime. fielding requests from every major outlet. CNN wanted him on primetime. Fox News offered a full segment with a flag backdrop. NBC floated the idea of a town hall on veteran issues. Even Colbert's team reached out for a more lighthearted conversation. His phone buzzed nonstop. His inbox doubled every hour. But JD didn't answer. He didn't post. He didn't tweet a victory lap or a moral mic drop. Instead, he stood by the window of his office, hands in his pockets, watching a group of school children walk past the Capitol below. Jackets too big, lanyards too bright. They pointed at the building with the quiet reverence of kids who still believed the stories written in civics textbooks. "Boss, they want you on Face the Nation this Sunday," his communications director said from the doorway, her voice somewhere between excited and urgent. "And the Atlantic wants a profile. Full spread." JD didn't turn around. "They want to frame it around the quote," she added. "You will not laugh at the man who gave you that seat. They say it's the line of the year." He looked out the window a second longer before finally replying. "I didn't say it for a headline." She stepped in, cautious. "I know, but this is the moment. If we lean in, shape the message, you could lead on this. Veteran dignity, small-town recovery, it's all aligned." He nodded slowly, almost imperceptibly, then turned and said simply, "No." She blinked. "No. To all of it?" "I don't need to sell a soundbite," he said. "I said what needed to be said. That's enough." She opened her mouth, then closed it. There was nothing else to pitch. JD walked back to his desk, pulled open the top drawer, and stared at the folded yellow paper inside. Louis's letter, the original, creased and worn. He hadn't unfolded it since the hearing. He didn't need to. He remembered every line. Across town, newsrooms debated whether he was genuine or just disciplined. On Twitter, a college student wrote, "I never cared about congressional hearings before, but this felt like something mattered." A veteran in Arizona stitched JD's clip into his own TikTok video and simply wrote, "That's the first time I felt like I was in the room." And yet JD didn't chase the applause. He didn't want a campaign around it. He didn't want it turned into merch. He didn't want to be turned into a brand. Because for him, that chair in the hearing room hadn't been a podium. It had been a promise. And promises, unlike press cycles, are meant to be kept quiet and kept strong. The sky over Cincinnati was the color of unpolished steel. No rain, but the air felt like it wanted to. JD stepped out of the black sedan without aides, without press, without a plan beyond the conversation that needed to happen. He walked up the same concrete steps he had 2 weeks earlier. Same chipped corner on the third step. Same flickering light above the shelter's entrance. Inside, the TV was playing an old Western with no sound. A few men sat hunched over cafeteria trays, half-eaten sandwiches and styrofoam coffee cups scattered around them like pieces of a quiet war. Louis was in the same chair. He looked up before JD spoke, as if he'd been expecting him. No salute, no formalities. Just a nod that carried the weight of someone who didn't need explanations anymore. JD pulled up the chair across from him and sat. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a phone, and held it between them. "I want you to see something," JD said. He tapped play. The footage wasn't fancy. No music, no commentary. Just the C-SPAN clip of JD in the committee room, reading Louis's letter aloud. The audio was clear. The room's silence even clearer. Louis leaned in slightly. He didn't blink. As JD's voice filled the shelter again, something shifted in Louis's posture. Not dramatically, just a slow, almost imperceptible drop of the shoulders. Like a burden he'd carried for too long was being acknowledged, if not lifted. When the line came, "You don't have to like me, but you will not laugh at the man who gave you that seat." Louis inhaled sharply through his nose. JD let the clip finish. Then silence. Louis's eyes were glassy, but he didn't wipe them. He looked out the window for a long moment before speaking. "You didn't flinch?" JD nodded once. "Neither did you." Louis exhaled through clenched teeth. His hands were clasped, knuckles pale. "I didn't think anyone would ever say it. Not like that. Not in that room." JD tucked the phone back into his coat. Louis leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "They call it a shelter, but we're not sheltered. We're shelved." The words weren't angry, just matter of fact. like he was reciting a truth he'd rehearsed in his own head for years. JD nodded again. We're not done yet. Louis looked at him. You mean this isn't just about a soundbite? JD shook his head. This is about making sure no one else in that room forgets who's missing from it. Louis didn't say anything, but for the first time since JD had known him, he didn't look like a man waiting to be forgotten. He looked like someone who'd been seen, truly, and found steady ground beneath his boots again. Across the room, someone turned the volume up on the TV. The Western faded to black and was replaced by a news report. JD's face appeared on screen, freeze-framed at the exact moment he delivered the line. Louis chuckled softly. You're famous now. JD smiled faintly. You are too. They just don't know your name yet. Louis tapped the side of his chair. Let's keep it that way. JD stood to leave. He reached out and shook Louis's hand. Firm, respectful, not as a politician, but as one man to another. A veteran, a witness, a keeper of a truth that had been ignored too long. At the door, JD paused and looked back once more. Louis didn't wave, didn't smile, just nodded again. And that was enough. Outside, the clouds still held their breath. But something in JD had shifted. Because while the cameras kept rolling in DC, the reason he'd started all this was still here, on a cold folding chair in a quiet shelter, with a man who had nothing left to prove, but everything left to fight for. The chairs in the Zanesville Community Center hadn't been this full since the high school wrestling finals 10 years ago, but tonight every row was packed. Veterans sat shoulder to shoulder in worn jackets, lined with patches from different wars. Some wore faded hats. Others sat silently, hands folded over canes. Beside them, widows with pinned photographs of husbands long buried. And in the back rows, teenagers in hoodies, earbuds dangling, curiosity written across their faces like a language they were just starting to understand. The fluorescent lights buzzed above like they always had. The air smelled faintly of powdered coffee and old varnish. But the mood inside was electric with something else. Presence. Not political fandom, not celebrity, but the need to be seen. To thank someone for speaking aloud what so many had swallowed for years. JD entered without fanfare. No music, no entrance line. Just him, in a worn suit, sleeves faintly creased from a long day of travel. As he walked toward the front, people didn't cheer. They stood, a quiet rising, like a flag lifting in the wind. He nodded hand over heart and took the mic. No podium. Just the wire in his hand and the weight of the room around him. I didn't come here to be honored, he said. I came to honor you. All of you. A few heads bowed. I've sat in rooms where they talk about you like numbers, budgets, percentages. But I've looked you in the eye, and I know better now. He paused, letting the silence settle like dust. When I read that letter, Louis's letter, in that hearing, I wasn't speaking for myself. I was reading what had already been written, in every town like this, in every folded flag, in every pair of boots by the back door that haven't been moved in years. From the second row, a woman slowly stood. She looked to be in her 60s, hair pinned tightly, cardigan buttoned to the top. In her hands, a small leather pouch. She walked to the front with deliberate steps, not rushed, not hesitant. When she reached JD, she opened the pouch and removed a pair of tarnished dog tags. She held them out, hands trembling. These belong to my husband, she said softly, voice steady. He died 17 years ago. Afghanistan. The tags have been in my drawer since. JD didn't speak. No one ever said what you said. Not like that. Not in that place. Not to her face. She glanced down at the dog tags, then back at him. You reminded Congress who paid the price. JD reached out, closed his hand gently around hers. Tags and all. I can't accept these, he said quietly. I'm not giving them to you, she replied. I'm asking you to carry them, just for a little while, until the rest of them start listening too. A breath passed between them. Then he nodded, placed the tags in his inside coat pocket, next to Louis's letter. For the rest of the night, he didn't speak much. He listened. To a mother whose son hadn't been the same since Iraq. To a young man whose brother came home and overdosed within a year. To a former factory worker who'd never served but said, I stood beside the ones who did. They didn't need policy talk. They needed witness. And that night, in a modest town hall tucked inside a town America rarely remembers, they remembered themselves. Not as votes, not as burdens, but as the reason this country still calls itself free. The set was clean, polished, the lighting warm, even flattering. The Sunday morning show had gone out of its way to frame the moment as a clarifying conversation, not a confrontation. The Chiron read, Representative Katie Porter on veterans, budget policy, in the viral moment. She adjusted her blazer before the cameras rolled, her tone even and measured, just like they had rehearsed. The host, a polished anchor with just enough empathy in his brow, led her in gently. Congresswoman Porter, the moment has clearly struck a chord with the American people. You've been criticized for laughing during a veteran's story. Do you regret your reaction? Katie offered a polite smile, the kind meant to signal composure, not contrition. Look, I respect the service of all our veterans, she began, but in that moment I was reacting to the framing, not the person. We can't allow individual anecdotes to override fiscal responsibility. That's the context. I wasn't laughing at a Marine. I was responding to a political tactic. The host nodded slowly, leaving her space to continue. This is about making sure our budget reflects the needs of all Americans, not just emotional appeals. The segment ended with a handshake. The network tweeted the clip with the caption, Katie Porter, I was reacting to framing, not the person. It was live for 12 minutes before the flood began. The first comment came from a former Army medic in South Carolina. Framing? You call a man's trauma a tactic? You laughed at my brother. Don't dress that up. A Navy vet followed. You didn't laugh at a budget proposal. You laughed when someone mentioned a Bronze Star. Don't insult us by pretending you didn't. By the afternoon, the network's social media manager had shut down comments across platforms. Clips from the town hall in Zanesville were now stitched side by side with her TV appearance. Louis' letter on one side, Katie's framing comment on the other. A widow in Texas uploaded a 90-second video with her late husband's photo behind her. My husband died not knowing if anyone in Washington still remembered his name. JD did. You didn't. That's all we saw. By evening, hashtag #NotJustFraming trended across X and Facebook, carried by veterans, military families, and civilians who were tired of being told that moral clarity was just media spin. And JD? He said nothing. No press release, no interview. No, I told you so. He spent the day meeting with housing advocates in Dayton, visited a mental health center in Portsmouth, shared black coffee with a retired colonel who now volunteered at a mobile food bank on weekends. When a reporter caught him outside and asked, Do you have a response to Porter's remarks this morning? JD offered only a slight shake of the head. I think the country already answered. That night, his staff found a handwritten envelope slipped under the office door. No return address. Inside was a note on lined paper, in pencil. I don't vote, haven't in 15 years. But if you keep talking like that, about the ones nobody talks about, I just might show up again. There was no name, just a set of military stripes drawn in the corner. Faint, almost childlike. JD placed the letter beside Louis and the dog tags from Zanesville, each tucked in the same drawer, not as trophies but as testimony. Because while Porter was trying to explain her laugh, America had already moved on to remembering what it sounded like when someone finally didn't. It started with 5 or 6. They came in mismatched envelopes, some crisp white, others yellowed with age, corners torn, postmarks faded. A few had no return address. One had a stamp of Elvis. Another was sealed with Scotch tape, and the words "Please read" scrawled in red ink across the front. By the end of the first week, J.D. Vance's D.C. office had received over 3,000 handwritten letters. Not emails, not tweets, not printed form letters with bullet points and policy pleas. Actual handwriting, the kind that dips and slants with emotion, that pauses between words, that carries the pressure of memory. A staffer named Marla had been assigned to open them, but within days the task became too large for one person. Volunteers stepped in, interns, legislative aides, even a retired Army officer who happened to be visiting the Hill and asked if he could stay and read just a few more. Some letters were 1 paragraph long, Others spilled over 4 pages. One came from a Marine Corps veteran in Michigan. You didn't just read a letter. You read our lives, out loud, in a place that never says our names unless we've died. A mother in Kansas wrote, "My son never made it home, but I listened to your voice, and for the first time in 10 years, I felt like he did." A woman from Florida enclosed a picture of her husband in uniform beside a rusty pickup truck. He used to watch those hearings and say, "They only care once we're folded in a flag." I think he would have liked you. But the most repeated phrase, the one that began showing up on bumper stickers, Facebook banners, even carved into wood by a retired carpenter in Indiana, was just 5 words. "We saw you stand." Those words weren't designed by a consultant. No one branded them. They rose from the people who had spent decades feeling invisible and finally saw a moment where someone stood in front of the system and didn't blink. In the corner of JD's office, a staffer cleared a shelf and began pinning up some of the letters. Not all of them, just the ones that felt like they had been written with hands still trembling. Each envelope had its own story, some misspelled, some shaky with age, some smeared by what might have been tears or rain. But together they formed a wall of voices louder than any headline. JD didn't speak about them publicly, but every morning, before his first meeting, he stood by the shelf for a few minutes in silence. One letter written on the back of a VA appointment slip simply read, "You reminded them we're still here." Another ended with, "You weren't loud, but we heard you." On a quiet Tuesday, Louis called. JD answered on the second ring. "Got a weird one," Louis said. "Somebody sent a letter to the shelter, addressed it to the guy JD read about. Had a $20 bill in it. Said, 'Not much, but thanks for speaking through him.'" JD didn't say anything right away. "Guess I'm a symbol now," Louis muttered. "You always were," JD replied. "They just didn't know it yet." In a world that lived by algorithms, the letters felt ancient, almost sacred. No one was counting likes. These weren't the voices of people chasing virality. These were the voices of people who had been waiting, years, decades, for someone to speak a truth that wasn't polished but felt. They didn't want applause. They wanted acknowledgement. And now they had it. In ink, in silence, in standing. The camera was barely steady. There was no lighting crew, no flag-draped backdrop, no overlaid title card announcing the moment. Just a desk, a worn navy blazer, a man who didn't want to go on camera, but knew he had to. JD Vance sat in his DC office late on a Thursday evening. Outside, the sun had dipped low enough to cast long shadows across the Capitol dome. Inside, the only light came from a desk lamp and the soft glow of the phone camera recording him. He hit record himself. No team, no director, just instinct. He looked into the lens for a long second before speaking. "This isn't going to be long, and it's not going to be polished. But I want to speak plainly to the people who've written, who've reached out, and especially to the ones who haven't, but were listening anyway." He took a breath, his voice level, steady. This wasn't a win, a pause, a quiet that forced attention. It was a wake-up call, not for Congress, for the country. The sentence landed without fanfare. It didn't need help. "I didn't plan to go viral. I didn't rehearse a speech. I read a letter from a man who deserved to be in the room. And couldn't be. His name is Louis, and like thousands of others, he served this nation." Then he came home to silence. I said his name because no one else did. Some people call that performance. Fine. But let me ask this. If no one's been listening for decades, maybe it's time someone performed the truth out loud. He didn't blink. He didn't smile. But his eyes were clear, unwavering. "I've read your letters. I've stood in your towns. I've shaken your hands outside shelters, in hospitals and VFW halls. I've heard the same sentence 100 different ways. We served. And then they forgot." He leaned forward slightly, resting his hands on the desk. "The reason I spoke up wasn't to trend. It was to remind people that patriotism isn't a party. It's a promise. And we've broken it. Too many times." Another pause, just long enough to feel real. This story wasn't about me. It was about someone who thought no one would ever read his words and watch the world stop when they finally were. He reached into his coat pocket and held up a folded paper, the same paper he'd carried since the hearing, the letter. He didn't write this for the cameras. He wrote it because he didn't think anyone would ever listen. Well, we're listening now, so let's not forget what we heard. No music faded in, no applause, just JD's final words. Some things don't need soundtracks. They just need to be remembered. He tapped the screen. The video ended. It was posted without promotion, no press release, no tweet storm, just a caption. A message to those who served and those who forgot them. Within 6 hours, it had 1.1 million views. By the next morning, it was playing on news channels, stitched into thousands of TikToks, and embedded in blogs written by school teachers, truck drivers, and veterans who hadn't spoken in public in years. By the 48-hour mark, it had crossed 12 million. And JD, he didn't give follow-ups. He didn't do interviews. He didn't release a statement. He just showed up for his next committee hearing, carrying that same folded letter in his inside pocket, creased, worn, and now unmistakably heard. While the headlines chased each other like dogs in a spinning wheel, J.D. Vance walked into his office one morning and slipped a clause onto page 17 of the upcoming Veteran Housing Allocation Act. It wasn't bolded. It wasn't announced at a press conference. There were no tweets, no staff photos, no rollout strategy, just a single paragraph, quiet, buried in subsection 332-F. The language was simple, a redirection of underutilized municipal funds, specifically those designated for non-priority development, into qualified veteran shelters and rural health clinics across 117 counties. No flashy language, no new taxes, no dramatic pivot, but it would quietly shift millions away from stalled bike paths, decorative landscaping projects, and long-dead community branding campaigns, and reroute them to places where vets were sleeping 2 to a cot, or lining up at underfunded mental health centers with broken HVAC systems and 3-month waiting lists. No one noticed, not at first. The big headlines that day were about tech regulation, an ethics scandal, and a congressional softball game where someone tore their ACL rounding third. JD didn't mind. In fact, he preferred it, because this wasn't about visibility. This was about correction, a rebalancing, not of money, but of memory. His team flagged the language to the committee clerks. A few analysts raised eyebrows, but it passed through without resistance. After all, it didn't cut funding. It just reassigned what most cities had left unused for 3 fiscal cycles. The numbers were clear, the language was clean, and it carried no name. Not JD's, not Louis's, no label that could be pinned, praised, or torn down. Just quiet policy, driven by a louder moment that had already faded from the 24-hour cycle, but had never left JD's mind. Later that afternoon, one of his junior aides approached him. "Senator, we just got the fiscal note back on the clause. That amendment you tucked in, it's going to move almost $38 million into direct use funding for housing and clinics." JD nodded, barely glancing up from his stack of case files. "Good," he said. "Should we draft a press release?" He looked at her for a moment, considered, then shook his head. "Let the clinics feel it before the cameras do." The aide hesitated, then smiled faintly and returned to her desk. Elsewhere, mayors and city clerks began receiving notification letters. Reallocation approved, veteran service provisions now eligible under municipal underspend reimbursement clause. Most of them didn't connect it to JD. They just adjusted their spreadsheets and moved forward. But in the margins, something was shifting. A shelter in Akron finally ordered industrial washers that had been on back order for 2 years. A clinic in rural West Virginia hired its first full-time trauma therapist since 2018. A mobile dental van in Indiana received a check that allowed it to run 4 days a week instead of 2. None of it made news, but it made a difference. And that was the point. Because when JD had stood in that hearing and said, "You will not laugh at the man who gave you that seat," it wasn't a threat. It was a commitment to follow through, to write policy in ink, not in applause, to move the needle, not the narrative. And now with one clause, on page 17, in a bill no one would read on cable TV, he had kept that promise. The news didn't break. It slipped in. Just a name, added quietly to the co-sponsor list of the Veteran Housing Allocation Act, under subsection 332-F, the clause that had quietly redirected millions into shelters and clinics for forgotten veterans. Porter, K. CA 45. No announcement, no podium, no tweet thread. When a Capitol Hill reporter reached out to her office for comment, the response was immediate and brief. No press comment at this time. For a moment, the political world blinked, because it didn't make sense. This was the same Katie Porter who had laughed, however briefly, however unintentionally, during a veteran's story. The same one who'd gone viral for the wrong reason, then floundered on national television with a phrase that still lingered like static in the ears of angry viewers. I was reacting to framing, not the person. And yet here she was, signing her name beneath a clause she hadn't written, one that quietly embodied the very truth she'd once dismissed. J.D. heard about it from a staffer. He was walking down the hallway outside the committee room when Marla caught up with him, tablet in hand. Sir, it just updated. Porter added her name to the bill. Your clause, J.D. stopped mid-step. Confirmed? Yes, sir. It's in the record, as of 10 minutes ago. He didn't say anything for a moment, just stood in the hallway, eyes narrowing slightly, not in skepticism, but reflection. No one else was around. No press, no cameras, just the hum of ventilation and the distant rhythm of heels on marble. She didn't have to do that, Marla added. J.D. nodded slowly. No, he said. She didn't. He didn't ask for a statement. He didn't draft a thank you. He didn't strategize. He just walked back to his office, sat at his desk, and opened the drawer that now held three things: Louis's letter, the dog tags from Zanesville, and a growing stack of handwritten notes from Americans who had whispered, "We saw you stand." When the bill passed the following Thursday, it did so without drama. The final vote tally scrolled across the monitors. Solid bipartisan support. The chamber didn't erupt. There were no thunderous floor speeches or declarations of legacy. But it passed. The funding would flow. The shelters would open. And the country, quietly, would remember. J.D. sat at his desk when the final count was confirmed. The room around him remained still. His team waited for him to react. He didn't. He just whispered, almost to himself. Good. That was all, because he hadn't done it to win. And he wasn't interested in victory laps. Somewhere in a rural clinic, a therapist would see a new patient this week. Somewhere in a half-lit shelter, a man would have hot water for the first time in months. And somewhere in a district she rarely talked about anymore, Katie Porter had quietly chosen repair over resistance. J.D. didn't see her that day. They crossed no paths, spoke no words. But somewhere deep in the politics of Washington, something rare had happened. Not concession, not rebranding, recognition. And though neither would ever say it publicly, both knew. The moment that had divided them in the hearing room had somehow built a bridge beneath them that neither expected, and both had chosen, quietly, to walk across. The hallway was unusually quiet that morning. Capitol Hill buzzed most days, filled with the murmur of aides, reporters chasing sound bites, the click of heels echoing off marble. But today, in that narrow stretch near the oversight wing elevators, the world seemed to move at half speed. J.D. Vance was standing alone, one hand gripping a folder loosely, the other adjusting his watch out of habit. He wasn't waiting for anyone. He was just breathing. After weeks of storm, silence felt foreign, but earned. The elevator bell chimed softly. He looked up. Katie Porter stepped out of the car. She was alone, no aides, no entourage, no clipboard of talking points. Just her in a navy blazer, hair tied back more tightly than usual, eyes scanning ahead as if she hadn't seen him. But she had. Their eyes met. For a second, the air thickened, not with tension, but with all the unspoken weight that had hung between them since that hearing, since the chuckle, since the clause, since the vote. Katie stopped walking. Just a beat. And then, without shifting her stance or breaking her stride completely, she gave him a single nod. It wasn't exaggerated. It wasn't theatrical. It was almost imperceptible. But it was intentional. A nod of acknowledgement, of respect, of something that wasn't quite apology, but wasn't far from it. J.D. returned it. No smile, no words, just a quiet, measured dip of the chin, like a soldier acknowledging another across the ranks, even after a difference of command. And then she moved on. No cameras flashed, no staffers gossiped, no headlines formed. But something passed between them in that moment, a mutual understanding. Not agreement, not friendship, not alliance, just recognition. They had both changed, just a little. She had seen a truth she couldn't unsee. He had felt a weight he couldn't uncarry, and both had done something about it, not for show, but because it was right. As the elevator doors closed behind her, JD remained where he was for a few seconds longer, staring at the brass panel on the wall across from him, his reflection warped and soft in the metal. He thought of Louis. He thought of Zanesville. He thought of the letter still tucked in his desk drawer, the one that had never been mailed but had somehow reached the very people it was written to. Then he exhaled, slow and even. Whatever came next didn't need applause. The country didn't need more noise. It needed moments like this. Small nods, big meanings, and no cameras. Just a hallway. And two people who, for one moment, stood on the same floor. The sign wasn't flashy. It didn't need to be. Just a clean brushed steel plaque affixed to brick above a modest door in Cincinnati. 4 words in bold serif letters. Louis stand for honor. It wasn't a ribbon cutting. No balloons. No news vans or sound bites. J.D. Vance had quietly declined media invitations. This wasn't about him. It never had been. Inside the shelter, the air held the faint scent of fresh paint and brewed coffee. Folding chairs lined the common room where veterans sat, not as an audience, but as witnesses. Not to a ceremony, but to a man. Louis's daughter stood at the front, palms lightly trembling as she unfolded a single sheet of paper. The corners were creased and softened with time. The letter. Her voice wavered at first, but then it held. I didn't lose my leg for silence, or for pity. I lost it hoping someone would still see me. The room stilled. One man lowered his head into his hand. Another rubbed the dog tag around his neck like it was rosary. J.D. sat in the back. No suit, just a gray shirt. Eyes red but dry. This was the first time he had heard the full letter read aloud. She paused midway through the paragraph where Louis wrote, Don't build me a statue. Build a country that doesn't need to forget me. That line stayed. A quiet hum moved through the room like a bowed note on a cello string. After she finished, there was no applause, just hands on shoulders, a silence that honored something deeper than words. Louis was gone, but he stood taller than ever. And now, in a shelter that bore his name, no one would walk in feeling invisible. In a rural Iowa high school just before third period, a civics teacher dimmed the lights. She clicked play. On the projector screen, J.D.'s voice echoed through the room, steady, measured, unmistakably real. You don't have to like me, but you will not laugh at the man who gave you that seat. A few students leaned in. Others stopped whispering. Midway through the clip, a boy in the second row raised his hand. Why didn't anyone stop her? The teacher didn't answer right away. She walked slowly to the board, picked up a piece of chalk, and underlined 2 words she had written earlier. Courage, consequence. Then she turned to the class. He did. Silence again, but not confusion. Something else. Understanding. Later that day, one student lingered after the bell. Was Louis real? The teacher smiled, then tapped the USB drive. In this class, and she said, what's real is what changes us. In Louis's hometown, a mural went up. It wasn't city-funded. It wasn't done by professionals. It was painted by a group of teens, veterans, and a local artist who said he'd never held a brush that mattered more. The mural stretched across the old hardware store wall. A figure in silhouette, missing a leg but saluting. Behind him, faint but unmistakable, the Capitol dome. Above the image, in white paint. You don't laugh at the uniform. You listen to it. No signature, no credits, just the message. Weeks later, J.D. walked past it alone. No speech, no entourage. Just him, hands in his pockets, pausing in front of the wall. A breeze tugged at his collar. He looked up. No camera caught what passed across his face. He stood for a while, then placed his hand on his chest. Just for a second. No words, just presence. Because some names don't fade, some letters don't need postage, and some truths, once spoken, echo without end. This story reminds us that real change often begins in silence, not with spectacle, but with sincerity. JD didn't win hearts by shouting louder. He did it by standing still when others laughed, by listening when others dismissed. Louis' story, so easily overlooked, became a symbol of those forgotten by systems built to honor them. The mural, the classroom, the shelter, none were political victories. They were human ones. This tale isn't about heroes in suits, but about dignity reclaimed in shelters, letters, and classrooms. It shows how one man's quiet stand can ripple across a nation starved for integrity. And maybe that's the real power. Not being remembered for shouting, but for refusing to stay silent when it mattered most. What about you? Have you ever witnessed a moment, big or small, when someone's quiet courage left a lasting mark? If this story touches you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to JD Stories, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching JD Stories.